Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. Bienvenidos a todos. Today we're going to discuss our latest report, Deep Trade Agreements Anchoring Global Value Chains in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a volume that's edited in partnership with the Office of the Chief Economist of Latin America and Caribbean region with the Macroeconomics Trade and Investment Global Practice. My name is Bill Maloney and I'm Chief Economist for the Latin American and Caribbean region at the World Bank. Before we get started, I just wanted to lay out a couple of housekeeping items. First, the event is available in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, so that at the bottom of your screen, there's a little logo that you click on it and you can choose whatever language suits you best. If you're following the conversation on YouTube, you can find the transmission in various different languages. Finally, please use the question and answer function, the Q&A function, to post any questions. And if you want to address them to a particular panelist, please make sure you include their name. I'm joined by two of our economists at the bank and authors of the report that I just mentioned. Michele Arruta is lead economist in the Macroeconomics Trade and Investment Global Practice of the World Bank, where he leads the work program on regional integration. Nadia Rocha is senior economist in the Macroeconomics Trade and Investment Global Practice of the bank as well. In addition to these two authors, we have three esteemed panelists with us today. First, Anabel Gonzalez, who is Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization. Marcela Eslava, who's Professor and Dean of Economics at the University of the Andes. And Constanza Negri Biasuti, Manager of Trade Policy at the Brazilian National Confederation of Industry. So we've got WTO, we've got academia, we've got the private sector, all to give us perspectives on both the report and on perspectives to the region and trade. I will now hand over the microphone to Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, who's Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean, for some opening remarks. Carlos Felipe.
Thank you very much, Bill. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the launch of this new publication. Let me start by thanking you, Bill, and for putting together this great panel that is very nicely balanced. And welcome to Anabel, to Marcela, and Constanza, who are joining us today. Our conversation, I think today is very timely and critical for our region. These are difficult times. Latin America faces big challenges right now because of this food and fuel crisis, the rising interest rates in the US and elsewhere, and the debt buildup of the last couple of years of the pandemic. We forecast at the World Bank that the region will grow only 2.5% in 2022. That is a low rate and certainly not enough to meet the expectations and progress on poverty or to address the underlying issues in inequality that are driving discontent across many of our countries. And we're very concerned about the slowdown of the global economy. It will hit Latin America big, the future of exports and investment flows. And on top of this, we have these geopolitical tensions that could imply long-term changes in the structure of trade and global value chains. So against all of this background, it is very clear that the region needs to change and to adapt to be successful in the future. This report that we're presenting today brings into focus a key element in this discussion, and this is the Deep Trade Agreements agenda. For those who don't know, deep trade agreements are agreements that go beyond simple trade. They go beyond tariffs. They touch upon a number of important elements, such as regulating investments, trade in services, customs procedures, regulatory measures, intellectual property rights protection, and so on. These kinds of agreements can be a big opportunity for Latin America and the Caribbean's growth, because sadly, most of our region, with some notable exceptions, remains fundamentally inward-looking and it needs to find ways to better integrate and take advantage of the opportunities of global and regional value chains. Engaging in more trade relations, both within the region and outside, can allow more competition at home, foster innovation, and increase our region's engagement in foreign markets. These deep trade agreements can be a useful tool here, and I think this publication helps to show why. It shows us how Latin American and Caribbean countries can leverage these deep trade agreements to increase their participation in trade and global value chains. When well-designed, these kinds of agreements can drive policy reforms, and they can help the region overcome some of its disadvantage in several ways. For example, trade facilitation, regulatory cooperation, opening the service economy, and regulating competition and state support to state-owned enterprises. In short, by dealing with behind-the-border issues, deep trade agreements offer a chance to rekindle economic dynamism in the region. So we know that the COVID-19 crisis and the geopolitical tensions may lead to a reorganization or strong changes in global value chains. By deepening and modernizing its trade agreements, countries in Latin America and the Caribbean could be well positioned to embrace new opportunities that may arise in a moment of global change, improve competitiveness, and set the basis for sustainable growth. So I think these are reasons why this is an important and exciting and relevant topic. And I want to thank you again for joining us today. I look forward to hearing your discussions. Thank you very much. Back to you, Bill.
Thanks very much, Felipe. Now we'll turn it over to Nadia and to Michele to present the key messages from your report. Nadia, Michele.
Thanks a lot, Bill, and good afternoon, buenas tardes a todos. Let me just upload my presentation. 1 second. Let me just. Okay, here we go. So thanks again. And Michele and I, we're going to be doing a short presentation of the report that we are launching today. So this report studies how Latin American countries could potentially leverage these deep trade agreements to promote their participation into global value chains. And as Carlos Felipe was mentioning, we are in an interesting moment in which we are coming out from a pandemic, there is the war in Ukraine, and together with the tensions between large economies such as the United States and China, all of these factors have highlighted the potential reorganization of global value chains. And this particular thing offers the region an opportunity to further participate and gain from global value chain integration. So what we claim in this report is that deep trade agreement, they can be a tool for the LAC countries to drive domestic policy reforms that are going to be key for the region to overcome some of its structural disadvantages and therefore fully benefit from global value chains. So throughout this presentation, I will illustrate the patterns of trade and global value chain integration in the region and the evolution and the potential impact of these trade agreements. And then Michele will focus on specific disciplines that are included in these trade agreements and their impact on or their role in GVC integration. So globally, we know that integration in international trade and global value chains, they are linked to increase in GDP per capita and productivity. We know that both exports and imports enhance productivity and growth through specialization, through increased competition and economies of scale, through better allocation of resources, and also to faster dissemination of technologies. After experiencing rapid economic growth in the first decade of the 21st century, due to mainly high commodity prices, the LAC region entered a phase of very weak performance. And as you can see in the graph that we have in this slide, we can see that the growth in exports and gross domestic product per capita between 2000 and 2018 was lower in LAC countries, which are represented by the blue diamonds in the graph, than in comparator countries in Europe and Central Asia, which are the orange dots, or in East Asia and the Pacific, which are the yellow triangles. Export growth for the average Latin American country was around 4% over 2000-2018, but it reached more than 7% for East Asia and the Pacific and for Europe and Central Asia. In terms of GVC participation, like the GVC taxonomy that was developed by the World Environment Report in 2020, and that is shown here in the map that you have in this slide, shows that Latin American and Caribbean countries mostly participate in commodities and limited manufacturing GVCs, with the exception of Mexico, which is in advanced manufacturing and services GVCs. You can see it over there. So this unlimited manufacturing, it goes hand by hand with low levels of backward participation in global value chains. This backward participation, it measures the extent to which firms import inputs to produce goods or services and then export these goods and services. So there is some evidence that shows that backward participation has a significant role in increasing productivity and economic performance across countries. And if we just think or look at Latin America, we can see that this backward participation was 16% of total exports of the region in 2015. And if we just look at other regions, such as East Asia and the Pacific and Europe and Central Asia, they had shares that were of respectively 20 and 30% in terms of backward participation. Now, let me move to like the patterns and evolution of what we call deep trade agreements. So as you can observe in this graph, like starting from the 1990s, there has been a growing number of countries that have signed this, that have signed an increasing number of agreements. And this can see, like this, we can see indeed in the yellow solid line that represents the number of cumulative agreements that have been signed by countries over time. And indeed, we have seen that while in the 50s, we had around in the 90s, we have around 50 agreements that were signed. If we just look at today, we have more than 300 agreements that are in force. And when you just look at the bars that are in this graph, you can see at the number of disciplines that are covered in these agreements. And what we can see is that these modern day trade agreements, they are increasingly deeper, which means that they cover a wide range of set of border and behind the border policy areas, such as regulating investments, services trade, custom procedures, or regulatory measures. So when we think about these deep trade agreements and we consider a world where production is fragmented across countries, we can think that these deep trade agreements, they will allow countries to reduce cross-border spillover effects of national policies and provide an institutional mechanism to bolster reforms that are going to reduce trade costs and that they are going to also increase or improve efficiency. Now, when we just put a lens into the Latin American countries and the evolution of these deep trade agreements, we can see that overall, also in Latin America and the Caribbean, there has been an increase in participation in agreements. And overall, the region participates to 82 preferential trade agreements, which represent more or less around 1/3 of the total agreements that have been signed by 2017 and notified to the WTO. Now, interesting, in many of the agreements that Latin America has signed, they are signed with partner countries that are outside the region. And overall, like we know that these agreements, they have lower tariffs across the board and across most of the countries in the region. Now, when we think about going beyond tariffs and the depth of these agreements, is very interesting what you can see in this figure with highlights like the level of depth of the different agreements that are signed by different countries in the region. And we can see like a dichotomy in terms of the depth of agreements signed like across Latin American countries. In particular, for instance, if we just take the countries of the Pacific Alliance, such as Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Mexico, and also several Caribbean countries, they tend to sign deeper agreements if we compare them with countries of the Cono Sur, like for instance, the countries that are part of the Mercosur that tend to have shallower agreements. Now, so I have been talking about the evolution of global value chains, also like the evolution of these deep trade agreements, and now like what is the relationship between like the two of them? And like the analysis that we have produced in this report, it shows that deepening existing trade agreements would deliver larger gains for Latin American and Caribbean countries than adding new agreements. And I guess this is interesting because it's a dilemma that usually countries face when they have limited resources in terms of the negotiations that they have to go through. So the analysis that we produce in the report indeed shows that the long-term effects of trade reforms, so deepening these agreements by the LAC countries would increase exports within the region by 4.4% and GDP by 1%. And you can see over there the results broken down by country. And just to provide you an illustration of some of the LAC countries going back, for instance, to the Pacific Alliance partners. So if we just consider like these countries like deepening the agreements that they currently have, they would gain in terms of exports, and in particular countries such as Colombia, like the exports within the region would grow by around 9%, followed by Peru, 4%, Chile, 3%, and Mexico around a little bit less than 1%. Now, if we just look at the impact of signing deepening agreements with the outside the region, the impact would be even higher. And I guess this is mainly driven by a scale effect. Now, what I show you in the previous analysis, it kind of is a long-term effect that abstracts from the changes in global value chains that have been induced by these agreements. But it's important to keep in mind that DTAs and mainly the content of these DTAs, they can lead to more GVC integration. And this is something indeed that Michele will come back in a moment. But just to conclude on my side, we can also see that DTAs can help countries they are also related with the fact that countries can upgrade in the kind of GVCs where they are participating. And indeed, what is illustrated in this graph is that the average number of the partners that a certain country has in terms of DTAs and the number of provisions or disciplines that are regulated, these tend to increase whenever countries are upgrading into these GVCs and they are moving from commodities and limited manufacturing to innovative activities. And this is a correlation, but it suggests that deeper integration in preferential trade agreements is also associated with GVC upgrading. Let me stop here, and Michele, you can continue.
So good afternoon, everyone, also from me. Here we are focusing more on what countries can do in order to leverage deep trade agreements. Now, the WDR, the World Development Report 2020, had a very interesting finding. Essentially, it concluded that there are four shaping factors of GVC participation. One is geography, the other one is market size, the third one is factors endowment, and the last one is institutions. Now, clearly, the region, the LAC region, is very heterogeneous, so it's difficult to say that this is true for all countries. But on average, countries in the region face several disadvantages relative to these four fundamentals. They tend to be far from large markets. Second, they tend to have fragmented markets, regional markets, which makes them smaller. Third, they tend to have lower capital and high skill endowments. And finally, in many countries, the economic institutions are weak. Now, the main message in our report is that deep trade agreements can alleviate these disadvantages. First, trade facilitation by reducing the border delays can ease the problems from remoteness. Second, regulatory cooperation can reduce the costs that are created by inconsistent non-tariff measures, inconsistent regulations, and therefore can make markets larger and allow firms to exploit economies of scale. Third, opening up services markets, broadly defined, so also allowing for foreign investment, movements of people, foreign business services, can help reduce some of these factor endowment scarcities. And finally, deep trade agreements can be an anchor for reform, especially those reforms that have to do with regulating state support and competition. Now, in the report, what we do is to provide evidence of each of these mechanisms. And here, for brevity, I will focus just on a couple of examples. Let me start with trade facilitation. So what we did was to take data, and we can move to the next slide. We took data for firm level data, sorry, the opposite direction. Thanks. So we took data from customs at the firm level for Peru, and we looked at the impact of provisions on trade facilitations in deep trade agreements on exporters. As you can imagine, this impact is positive. If we reduce trade facilitation bottlenecks, it's easier to export. But this effect is much larger for firms that are anchored to GVCs. And the intuition is fairly simple in this case, because these firms not only export, but they also import intermediates. So they gain from trade facilitation provisions, both on the domestic border and on the destination, the border at the destination market. The other example that I want to show is about regulatory convergence. Very often, these trade agreements include provisions that have to do with technical barriers to trade. And the goal is to reduce these inconsistencies in regulations across countries that fragment markets. Now, what you see in this figure is that they also help anchoring to GVCs. So if we take the deepest of the agreements in our sample in terms of the TBT provisions, the impact on the import value of intermediates is around 70%. If we take one of the lower one is the EFTA Mexico, the impact is around 20%. So still positive, but much, much lower effect. Now, the last point that we want to discuss is what countries can actually do. So the argument that we are developing in this report is that obviously the large literature that we have seen that deals with the question of should Latin American countries integrate with each other or should they integrate with advanced economies is an important question. But there is a second important question, that is what should this integration be about? What should the content of trade agreements be about? And we provide a sort of action plans of priorities. And here, just to simplify, there are three type of actions that countries should consider for the trade agreements. The first is to include provisions that improve transparency and monitoring. So an example would be in the trade facilitation, they could include a commitment to publish online all the customs requirements. Second, the agreement should be ambitious and should try to have deep policy commitments. An example would be include chapters that deal with investment, include chapters and provisions that deal with the mutual recognitions of professionals. And the last point relates to implementation. Implementation is often a big problem in trade agreements. Trade agreements can include governance and enforcement structures that can increase the probability that trade agreements are effectively implemented. So for instance, in the case of regulatory cooperation, what some agreements do is that they formalize the cooperation between regulators. They have clear targets and they have the mechanism in place to monitor and create accountability. So let me stop here. The last thing that I want to do is just to circle back to what Carlos Felipe and Nadia were saying about the current situations and the relevance of this report. So in the next few years, it's clear that the world economy will adjust to the various shocks that have been hitting it. How this will impact global value chains is still very uncertain and unclear, in part because it will depend a lot on the policies that the various actors will enact. The point that we make in this report, and allow me to use a language from game theory, is that pursuing the path of deep trade agreement for Latin American countries is a dominant strategy. This essentially means that whatever the other players will do, it will still beneficial for Latin American countries to pursue deep trade agreements. Let me stop here and thank you so much again.
Thanks, Michele, and thank you, Nadia. That's, of course, a very brief overview of the very rich report that covers a lot of areas and has a lot of new information that I think will be of use for policymakers across the region. I'd like to turn to our distinguished panel right now, and I'd like to begin with Anabel. You've had many hats in the world of trade. You were minister, you were researcher, and now you're WTO Deputy Director General. Latin America has a particular paradox, which is that it's kind of under-exporting given the number of trade deals that it has, but also it doesn't seem to be picking up some of the reshoring or reorganization of global value chains that's happening. There's a lot of movement out of China into other countries of Asia, but right now the wages in that area are approximating what we have in Latin America. Why is it that LAC is having such trouble integrating in the world economy and lifting its trade flows? And where do you think these kind of deeper trade agreements could make a concrete contribution to greater integration?
So, hola, buenas tardes. Thank you very much, Bill. It's
good
a
afternoon.
pleasure to join this very distinguished panel. And I want to start by congratulating Felipe, yourself, Michele, Nadia, and all the authors on this excellent publication that you're launching today. I think the report makes a very effective use of new data, including firm-level data, to show where trade agreements in Latin America and the Caribbean have fallen short and how countries in the region can make better use of trade agreements and trade policy more broadly to drive growth and prosperity. And the analysis and messages that come out of the report, I think, are very valuable, especially at a time when governments in the region and elsewhere may be tempted to turn their backs on trade openness and resort to protectionist import substitution playbook of the past. Now, turning to your question about the obstacle to the region's participation in trade, the long and short of it is that the cost of trading across borders in Latin America and the Caribbean remains high compared with regions that are more integrated into global value chains. And that's not a good place for the region to be, especially in an interconnected world where participation in global value chains offers the most direct path to improve productivity growth along the region's Achilles heel. Now, the overall finding of the report that trade policy and trade agreements can be very effective tools to reduce trade costs chimes with my own experience as Minister of Trade, trade negotiator, researcher, and now at the WTO. And I also agree that policy action in the 4 priority areas identified in the report, trade facilitation, regulatory cooperation, services, trade, and subsidies, could deliver huge reductions in trade costs and help the region businesses break into global value chains. So let me make a few observations on each of these 4 issues. First, trade facilitation. Deep trade agreements can be particularly effective tools to improve coordination, especially the deep cross-country coordination that is essential to implement advanced trade facilitation measures such as pre-arrival processing and interoperable single windows, for example. And the need to pay attention to coordination both within countries and between countries to make trade facilitation work was actually one of the messages coming out of an event that we held in Geneva just a few days ago to mark the 5th anniversary of the implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. Now, a closely related issue is that of trade and transport-related infrastructure, an area where Latin American countries tend to rank low. And there is room to use deep trade agreements more proactively here, for example, to improve coordination on infrastructure investment, especially between neighboring countries. And we have ample evidence showing that the gains from transport and other trade-related infrastructure investments are substantially larger when countries coordinate their action to take account of the positive spillovers resulting from infrastructure investment. Second, regulatory cooperation. Here, deep trade agreements should pay special attention, in my view, to the increasingly important role of sustainability standards and regulations in global value chains. We are seeing, of course, that more companies are adopting decarbonization strategies and traceability schemes, while governments are increasingly tightening their climate regulations to meet Paris Agreement goals. And this is good news, but it also creates challenges. The rapid proliferation of climate measures seen in recent years risks segmenting markets and keeping small businesses, which normally are not that well equipped to comply with data-intensive climate measures, from breaking into green supply chains. So deep trade agreements, I think, also have a role to play here, and it's a dual role. First, they can foster the close regulatory cooperation needed to avoid unnecessary differences between regulations across countries. And second, they can also offer an opportunity for countries to join forces to develop a shared quality infrastructure system. And a well-functioning and modern quality infrastructure system is essential to facilitate compliance with sustainability standards and increase the chances that green businesses in the region can scale up their activities. Now, turning to services trade, I think the report confirms that Latin America and Caribbean have followed a piecemeal and largely inconsistent approach to services trade in their trade agreements. And this, I think, is probably, I'd say, one of the big missed opportunities in the LAC region. For one thing, we know that services trade are very important in global value chains, whether as inputs into the production of manufacturing and agricultural goods or in the production of services themselves. And what's more, digitalization and innovation and investment in data-related technologies are driving new export and innovation opportunities in services. And in LAC, LAC is really home to one of the most vibrant tech scenes in the developing world. So it does have a lot to gain from policies to expand digital services trade. So, governments in the region should step up efforts really to slash barriers to services trade while fostering access to digital technologies and strengthening digital, managerial, and related skills, a topic that I know you worked a lot in, Bill. Now, all this, I think, could make a big contribution to the region's economic diversification and upgrading. And finally, on subsidies, this is an area that has long posed a challenge for trade agreements, both at the global and regional levels. And the report highlights how deep trade agreements could make a difference. And it talks about improving transparency, strengthening evidence-based analysis, and maybe paving the way for better policy dialogue and eventually reform through stronger disciplines in deep trade agreements. And many sectors in the region would benefit from subsidy and competition disciplines in trade agreements. Take electricity, for example. In LAC, this is among the most expensive regions in the world when it comes to the price of electricity, and that's due to many factors. But the dominance in the sector of inefficient public utilities and poorly targeted energy subsidies surely play a role. So well-designed and ambitious international subsidy and competition policy commitments could help reduce the inefficiencies of the electricity sector as part of a broader national competitiveness strategy. And I have to mention Costa Rica's experience in opening the telecom monopoly in the context of the Dominican Republic, Central America, US FTA as an example of how trade agreements can drive policy reforms that further strengthen a country's participation in GVCs. So to conclude, today's report is very timely. Businesses are looking at reorganizing their supply chains in response to new risks and opportunities. The LAC region could benefit from this evolving landscape, but to benefit on a scale that really makes a difference, the region must up its game and use trade policies and trade agreements more effectively and proactively to reduce trade costs. And the report that you're launching today lays out a very sound blueprint for doing exactly that. So thank you, Bill.
Excellent, Anabel. Thank you very much for that comprehensive overview of the challenges we face in terms of expanding our trade footprint in the world. I want to turn to Marcela right now. Marcela, you are one of the experts on productivity and productivity growth in the region. I'm an avid consumer of your articles. And yet we both know that in the region right now, productivity growth has been depressed for maybe 10, 15 years, even in the countries that have undertaken the most reforms. We know that trade is not a silver bullet for improving productivity. And maybe that's part of the reason that, as Annabelle said, some governments are saying, hey, openness is overrated. On the other hand, what the report stresses is that trade can help drive important reforms, productivity enhancing reforms at home. And it also, of course, has a direct impact on productivity. But maybe you can elaborate on those different channels and how important you think that trade is towards productivity growth, and what we should be thinking about as governments approach new deals, such as we're talking about here with deep trade agreements.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Bill and the team, for the invitation to be part of this great panel. Let me start by congratulating and thanking the team for what is truly an extremely useful report for all of the reasons that Annabelle just went in detail through. This is extremely timely. This is a time where throughout the region, as in other regions of the world, there are concerns such as the ones that Bill has mentioned, not only from the part of governments, but also the public more generally, and some economists as well. So this is a crucial time to rethink about the importance of trade, ways to improve trade, and the correct ways to improve trade in a way that is welfare enhancing. So let me answer your question, Bill, by first sort of summarizing a little bit what we know about what trade has done in the region, and also the reasons why there is the growing concern that we were referring to a few seconds ago. I think the literature and in part the research that you were mentioning, Bill, just a minute ago, has undoubtedly shown that there have been undisputable gains from the increase in trade and in general in integration with the rest of the world in Latin America, starting in the 90s and then into the past few decades. Productivity is a very big word that encompasses many things. And I think we are all ultimately worried about welfare and inclusive growth, and that's where productivity plays a role. If we think about it in those broader terms, the kinds of gains that we've seen from trade, I think can be very easily identified by anyone. If you are a consumer who was already a consumer before the 90s, you know that the availability of varieties, the kinds of goods that you can access in the region, the prices of those goods in relation to the goods that you are able to acquire outside has greatly improved. If you think of how the roads in the cities looked, the streets in the cities looked like 30 years ago, you will see that people were driving very backward cars. Nowadays, in Latin America, you see the same kinds of cars that you see in the rest of the region. That is the expression that the consumer sees of this improvement in productivity that takes many routes. Of course, one is the direct import of those goods, but we also see that producers see increased access to foreign imports, which means more varieties of inputs to source from, better prices that can be then transferred to consumers, and access to foreign technologies, which in turn improve productivity. They also modernize. We see a much more modern industrial production in the region, and that has also meant that the industry in the region demands workers with higher skill and has eventually absorbed human talent that has thus felt compelled to train in higher standards to be able to participate in this kind of production. So all of those effects are things that we can relate to. Of course, these gains have not been without controversy. It is clear, I think the literature has clearly pointed at very large increases in inequality that are partly linked to the increase in trade and precisely to the fact that trade impacted production in a way that required more or higher skill, and that implied a displacement of lower skilled workers that ultimately had the good impact that people trained with the higher education provision that governments ensured, but with the implication of a very large transition with a large increase in inequality at the end of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s in the region. So that's one reason for the kinds of concerns that we see today. Two, it is also the case that the raw rates of growth in the region have not been higher afterwards compared to the previous periods, and that has also raised concerns. What many people do not know is that that's the case throughout the world, and it is not clearly linked to the increase in trade. Rather, the countries that saw the most increase in trade during this period are the ones that also saw greater or better growth rates compared to the rest of the world. And that's, I think, a second reason why we see the kind of concerns that we also see. Third, part of the good things that we see from trade have to do with access, as I was describing, to better quality goods. Better quality goods are also more expensive goods. And so when we see that in the data, what that looks like is inflation. It looks like inflation. And so in many instances in the measurement of growth, we confound these increases in quality with increases in inflation and therefore deduct those increases in quality from growth. And that's also a source of measurement error that implies that we in general tend to believe that this is a time of low growth, when if you look at the people in the streets, what you see is actually more welfare than you saw before. And this is true not only in Latin America, but throughout the world. And then finally, of course, the recent pandemic and the fact that we're seeing the kinds of effects that we see from supply shocks as we've seen in the past 2 years, and the exposure that being integrated to global markets implies for countries that have increased difficulty sourcing when we see the kinds of supply shocks that we are seeing, has also placed concerns. So what do all these things mean for your question on what do we do looking into the future in terms of whether to foster trade and how to do that in the best way possible, and what is the role for deep trade agreements and in all of this? I think there are basically four main lessons. The first, I think, is that trade is clearly an important source of welfare gains going through productivity, but also much more generally, so that deepening integration with global markets remains crucial even today. Beyond all the gains that I think the literature has shown, I like to think of trade as sort of the enabler of diverse projects of life. Basically, if we have people who want to do very diverse things in an economy that is small, such as many economies in Latin America, perhaps not Brazil, but the rest of the economies of the region are not sufficiently large to house all sorts of projects of life, or better to have users and consumers for all the things that people would want to produce, then you need to have a broader source for clientele, and that's and for customers, and that's where you need also the rest of the world. So securing better access to other markets for your products and providing a way for you to source from products from other countries and for services is crucial. I think that's a first conclusion from the evidence that we've seen in the past. The second conclusion is, of course, that these gains are likely to be distributed very unevenly, that creates concerns, that creates movements against trade, and that it creates decreases in welfare for many people, and we need to fight that. So it is clear, I think, that education is the basic source of leveling the playing field for everybody. The ability to retrain workers, to adapt to the new technologies, to adapt to the new kinds of services and products that you produce is crucial. And so any conversation about trade needs to think about how we are going to prepare people for a good transition. And I think a third lesson from all of this is precisely that exposure to external dependence does imply some vulnerabilities. And that's, I think, where intra-regional trade and improving trade in Latin America within the region plays a crucial role. Many of the traumatisms that we've seen have to do with the fact that we are depending for consumption, both intermediate and final, on markets that are very far away, that are with whom it's very difficult to cooperate in terms of the kinds of measures that governments take in terms to face shocks. And I think intra-regional trade is going to be crucial. The study is very effective in showing how Latin America has been particularly bad at fostering trade intra-regionally as compared to with other regions of the world. And the shortfalls are particularly focused precisely on how deep the trade agreements are within the region. And so I think that's a third lesson from the report and from the previous evidence. And then finally, the context today is clearly one where the barriers to trade do not lie in tariffs, but rather in non-tariff regulations and barriers to trade. And the context today and the report are very clear in pointing at the importance of trade in services. That's where most of the resources of our economies lie. We are past, in the region and in other regions, we're past industrialization, and the possibility of going back and picking up just from industry production does not look plausible. And so in that sense, trade in services and removing non-tariff barriers that are particularly important for trade in services is crucial. And that's also a place where deep trade agreements are crucial. Speaking today from Europe, where those barriers are very minor, and the kinds of things that I've been able to do moving across countries here, and that imply that producers can hire from different parts of the world, of the region, that they can source from different parts of the regions, the electricity and internet, and all those things come from all of the region, cannot be done in Latin America. And that's where deep trade agreements play a crucial role. Thank you.
Great, Marcela. Thank you very much for the, again, comprehensive view of what the literature is telling us about the gains from trade and how we could enhance the impact of trade on the welfare of our citizens in the region. I want to turn to Constanza, and now that I think about it, we should have begun with her, because the private sector is what drives everything here, not the World Bank and not the WTO and not academia. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you see the agreements that we're talking about in this book as being useful for the private sector in facilitating the expansion of firms and the integration of global value chains.
Thank you very much, William, and it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to echo the congratulations from my previous speakers and colleagues to the World Bank team and experts for the publication. I think it really brings a clear picture of what we see today in the region from the private sector perspective in terms of the type of free trade agreements and in terms of the lack or limited type of integration to global value chains. But, and also it's not just about the picture, but it's also, it doesn't stay in the picture and the diagnosis. It also provides concrete proposals for this agenda, which I think is extremely relevant and timely for the private sector, especially when you think that, for instance, just as an example, in the case of Brazil, the country in the private sector that I represent, exports of industrial goods have as the most relevant markets Latin America region. So Brazilian exports of added value medium and high-tech exports, they are extremely concentrated in Latin America. So this can give sort of the relevance that we have in terms of this regional integration agenda. But allow me to do some general comments before getting to the specific questions. So from the private sector perspective, when we cross on one side, the relevance of the region in terms of geographical destination of our exports, especially industrial goods, I would say even more. Second, we cross with the new patterns of our trade and investment flows. And I would even say more, the way in which companies operate today. They don't just export and import anymore. They export goods with services content. They import services as input for the export of their goods. So industrial companies, they export services as well today. And they are not worried only with tariff at the border, but much more, even according to some sectors, with, let's say, the burden that can come with divergences in terms of regulation among different countries, with the lack of good regulatory practices, with the time it takes to clear goods due to the lack of a proper risk management process in different countries. So this is the daily, let's say, life of companies, the worries that they have. So when we cross these two elements, the relevance of the region, the new patterns of trades and investment, and on the other side, we look into the trade policy initiatives and the type of trade agreements that we have in the region, there's clearly a mismatch and a gap there. So the software and the hardware, they are not completely working together and updated in terms of giving responses to those two elements. So as identified in the report, there are some exceptions when you do this crossing, specifically those FTAs where we find broad type of areas in their compromises and commitments. So let's say deep trade agreements, but those are mainly with extra-regional partners. In the case of Brazil, this search, if you do it in the region, it will take you less than a second to find. There's only one example, the Brazil and Chile recently agreement that includes more, let's say, broad aspects or in terms of examples. So I would say that in a certain way, what we see from the private sector, not only we have been model takers, if I can say so, in terms of broad type of agreements, but also even more, in some cases, those agreements with extra-regional partners, they have been let's say, the drivers and the ones that have leveraged the update of the internal or intra-regional agreements that we have in the region. And there's one clear example in this where we have seen it from very close is the EU-Mercosur agreements. There were several compromises within the agreement with the EU that they were lagging behind when you would look into the intra-Mercosur agenda. So several agreements in the area of services, trade facilitation, in what it was supposed to be a customs unit like Mercosur, they didn't have updated compromises like in the case of the EU-Mercosur agreement. So this is what we have been witnesses in terms of type of agreements. So when you ask me about advantages, so what are the advantages, the main that we see in terms of these deep trade agreements? By including facilitation, regulatory cooperation, services, state support disciplines, and even more, I would say, I would include investment facilitation. The main advantage, and very simple, is that they become much more real and relevant with a lower risk of being under-implemented or sub-utilized by companies, by firms, and by economic operators, and with a higher chances to contribute to a better long-term integration with the regions and especially into global value chains. But there's also some disadvantages and probably some drawbacks that I would like to raise here. One is more linked to the governance and institutional coordination. So due to the broad scope that this type of agreements involve, several actors at the government level, government agencies are involved. Sometimes, and we have seen clearly this in Brazil, are government agencies which are not usually involved in the trade agenda. I would even say in some cases, they don't even have a self-perception, the relevance that they have for the trade agenda. And if they are not involved since the very beginning of the negotiation and in that trade agenda, the compromises that might be included in those agreements, they risk not being well implemented. And we do have some examples here, for instance, the recent protocols that Brazil signed with the US in terms of trade facilitation and good regulatory practice. So I would say there is some sort of change of mind. The chip of those agencies and the government needs to be updated for them to understand that they have a relevant participation in this new type of agreements. A second drawback that I see is more linked to the concept of deep and that, let's say, line between deep and broad. So, because either it's about just including the new areas, but in a way that it would just replicate what it exists at the WTO level, for instance, and nothing beyond that. So this is not bad per se from the private sector perspective, but I would say that it's a suboptimal. And also, in other cases, the term in terms of concept is a sort of overstretch of the concept of deep and the efforts that we currently see to respond to very legitimate concerns in domestic areas like environment, labor rights, through just one policy initiative like an FTA. So I think that it's extremely challenging, but it's also very important to keep in mind that there needs to be the right balance. There needs to be find the right balance between that deepness and broadness of the content of the agreements. And third drawback that I can see is some sort of a mix of the first and the one that I've mentioned here is that the conclusion and the approval process. So this type of agreements, due to this broadened scope, to the different actors that are involved at the executive, legislative, in terms of civil society, they of course raise awareness, question, doubts, concern, and this really demands a new strategy, another way of leading with this process of an engagement on the civil society and the government, and a proactive engagement. Otherwise, it can become very troublesome afterwards for them to enter into force. So this leads me to the last comment on how to ensure that those agreements, these deep trade agreements, are responding to the needs on the ground and contribute to the Latin America economic integration and job creation. I would say 3 elements. We need to understand that these agreements, they come as an additional tool, an additional opportunity, but we also need to keep in mind that it needs to go hand in hand with structural reforms that our countries faces in terms of competitive challenges. Many times in Brazil, we say that we export taxes. We have structural challenges that need to be sorted out together with FTAs and the trade policy agenda. Second, that they need to be conceived in a close dialogue and consultation with the private sector and civil society for them to bring real benefits and to ensure that they are rightly implemented to improve productivity and stimulate economic growth and job creation. And finally, what it was already mentioned here, that we need to remember to keep in mind that the current international context that we are seeing, it requires updated and timely adjustment in terms of policy in order to return to economic growth. And this is certainly one area where Latin America as a region, but also as sub-regions and group, it has some pending assignments there and some areas where it can be improved. So just to finish, I would say that this report from the private sector perspective, I see it as a roadmap that it can help us advance this trade policy agenda. And I'm hopeful that we can keep on working with the World Bank to foster this type of agreements more and to bring more discussions with private sector from different countries with whom we are already working to deepen this agenda. Thank you very much.
Great, Constanza. Thank you. Sorry. Thanks very much for the view from the private sector. We've run over a little, but that's because we've had an abundance of rich commentary, and so I wouldn't have wanted to cut any of that off. But I do want to bring it to a close to begin by thanking our panelists, Constanza Negri, Anabel Gonzalez, and Marcela Eslava, for these very fine insights into how we might go forward with this agenda, To our two presenters, to Nadia and to Michele, thanks very much for an excellent report. And to Felipe, thanks for your introductory remarks. The report is available online. Please download it. It's free and it's very comprehensive, so it's a bargain. So thank you all very much for your time, and we look forward to continuing this discussion. So long.